right, so this next portion of Unit 4A is going to be on communication and how cell communication and communication between cells can result in maintenance of homeostasis. So we're going to talk about some communication devices that our body uses, and then we're going to focus on one in particular. Hormones are chemical signals that our body is able to give off, or I should say our cells are able to secrete. They're able to give off into the circulatory system. So they're being put into the blood vessels, into the bloodstream. And then they're communicating with a target that is not close by. It's a target that is somewhere usually pretty remote to where it was released. Chemical signaling by the hormones is the function of what we call the endocrine system. So you may have at one point or not encountered somebody called an endocrinologist. An endocrinologist is a person whose specialty is hormones. Many endocrinologists specialize in looking at basically diabetes. They'll specialize in diabetes because diabetes is such an epidemic. But there's other hormones as well, things like thyroid issues, like if you have a hyper or a hypothyroid condition. Those are some common ones as well. Also, you might have someone who's an endocrinologist is working in more something like fertility. So looking at how can a couple get pregnant. There's other communication methods as well, and I want to go over those briefly. One of them is the nervous system. So my psych people will have probably heard some of this already. The nervous system is a network of specialized cells, and its job is to communicate from the brain to the other areas of the body. So the rest of the body gets communication from the nervous system. Between the nervous system and the endocrine system, that's basically how our body controls all of the functioning going on in our body, and all of the homeostasis set points and all that is maintained in conjunction with nervous system and with the endocrine system. So this is a picture of all of the different glands. Gland is just a group of cells that its function is to give off or secrete different hormones. So there's lots of them. Some of them you're probably familiar with, and some of them you're probably not. For example, we talked before about glucagon and insulin and how they regulate blood glucose. That would be the job of the pancreas. If you are a biological female and you have ovaries, then that is going to be where estrogen and progesterone are produced. If you are biologically a male and you have testes, then that is where the testosterone is going to be produced. And then there's other ones that are less common that are also important. Some of you have been doing for your homeostasis project, you did the menstrual cycle. So you talked about things like follicle stimulating hormone, and that would be released by the pituitary gland. Thyroid gland, like I said, that is pretty common disorder for people to have, where they have hypothyroidism, where you're feeling sluggish all the time and you tend to gain weight, just really tired. And that is hypothyroidism. Hyper is a little less common, and that's where you're having overactive thyroid gland and just feel jittery all the time, heart racing. And thyroid is responsible for producing things called thyroid stimulating hormone as well. Sorry, I think thyroid stimulating hormone might be in the pituitary, but it produces T4 and then T3, which are common. If you go in and get blood work, they'll often check those. So if you see a T4 or a T3 or even a TSH, that's checking your thyroid levels to see if your thyroid's okay. And if you're really tired all the time, that's one of the first things they'll check out. I could go on for a long time about these, but I'm going to I'm not going to, just because we have other things to do. Okay, so hormones and other signaling molecules bind to target receptors, and that once they do that, then that causes some type of response to occur. Animals use chemical signals in a lot of different ways. There's intercellular communication, so within the body, one cell can communicate with another. So one cell, like in the brain, could communicate with a cell in the testes or a cell in the pancreas. You can classify these types of communication by a couple things. First of all, the type of cell that is doing the secretion, as well as the route that's taken to the bloodstream. And there's a couple different ones that they're going to show you, and we're going to look at here momentarily. And then we're going to come back to the one that we're really focusing on, which is going to be the endocrine system. So A here shows endocrine system signaling. I'm going to talk about these and come back. They're kind of small pictures. Paracrine, autocrine, and then synaptic is nervous system. And then neuroendocrine is a combination of neurons and endocrine system. So let's talk about them in more detail. Okay, some signals are local. We talked about endocrine at the very beginning, and I said that in the endocrine, the signaling starts one place and it usually moves quite a distance. There's also times where cells just want to communicate with cells that are nearby, and that would be things like paracrine signaling. So paracrine signaling is where when a cell releases a chemical message, its target cells are going to be pretty close by. They're going to be nearby. And so, for example, there are different cells in the thyroid that can communicate with other cells in the thyroid. Or you could talk about the pancreas. We talked about how there's insulin producing cells and there's glucagon producing cells. Those could communicate with one another. If insulin's being produced, glucagon, you don't want to have that because those are reverse processes. Insulin is going to cause glucose to be brought into the cell, made into glycogen, whereas glucagon is going to do exactly the opposite. So those cells need to communicate. If they're saying, hey, I just did this, then that's a signal to the other group of cells to say, hey, no, don't, because you're going to undo everything I just did. So that would be an example of paracrine. Autocrine signaling is where the cells are usually the cells that started the message in the first place. So it's really a feedback mechanism to say once enough of a chemical message has been secreted or released, to say, okay, that's enough. We've done our job. We can shut down now, and we don't have to continue releasing that chemical. So those are the local ones. Paracrine and autocrine signaling play roles in things like blood pressure regulation, nervous system, as well as reproduction. Local regulators that mediate such signaling are called prostaglandins. So when we're talking about the chemicals that are released, we're talking about prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are also responsible for functioning in the immune system as well as blood clotting. So those are all local responses where either the target cell is close by or it is the target cell itself the cell that's sending the message is the target cell. What I want to spend the rest of this lecture talking about is endocrine signaling. And endocrine signaling is where hormones are secreted from a cell into the bloodstream. And then they have to travel a pretty good distance usually to reach another cell that is the target cell. Endocrine signaling maintains homeostasis, which is why we're talking about it now. With the rest of our topics. Excuse me. There are a couple types of signaling with the endocrine system. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about things that also interact with the endocrine system, and that would be the nervous system. And in the nervous system, we don't have endocrine signaling, we have synaptic signaling. So if you're taking AP Psych, you probably know that there's a gap between two nerve cells that's called a synapse, which is where the word synaptic comes from. And basically, if you haven't taken psych, that's not a problem. Just remember that this is nervous system signaling that we're talking about. In synaptic signaling, the neurons are specialized. They have these tiny little gaps that are called synapses. I don't know if I have a picture of that, so I will draw it. Oh, that's pretty bad, but anyway. This would be one cell. And that would be the second cell. And then there's this tiny little gap in between here. And that is the synapse. It's a very short distance, like, microns, a hundredth, thousandth of a millimeter. It's a very, very small distance. And what will be released is a chemical signal called a neurotransmitter. So this could be the sending cell. One cell is sending the message, and then the second number 2 there, is receiving that message. There are receptors that are on the surface of that second cell that will recognize and bind to, attach to that chemical signal and cause some other response to occur. We also have on here neuroendocrine. And that is a combination. So now I've got a signaling cell that's part of the nervous system. But now I'm just going to make a big, that's pretty bad. Its goal is to get to some type of target organ. But it still releases a molecule, and those molecules, wrong color. Are going to be released, and they're going to travel to that target cell. But to get there, they're going to have to go through the bloodstream. Okay. So they're kind of acting like hormones, but they're released from the nervous system, not from the endocrine system. So they're not released from the thyroid or the pancreas or the ovaries, etc. Gesundheit. All the things we've been talking about so far are internal, meaning that it's one cell in your body communicate with another cell in your body. There's also something called pheromones. And pheromones are communications messages that are given off into the environment. So, for example, if you have a dog that has not, especially female dog, that has not been spayed, that means to take out the uterus and the ovaries. If that has not occurred, your dog will, once it becomes sexually mature, will go through a period of 4 to 6 weeks called heat, where they become sexually receptive to male dogs. It also means that they release a pheromone that we can't really smell, but that drives the male dogs pretty crazy. And so if you've got a dog in heat, you've got to be very careful, because male dogs will be able to smell that pheromone from a long way, a few blocks away. Maybe it's more than that. I don't even know. I'm not a dog. So one of the reasons for spaying and neutering is because you don't need any unwanted puppies out there. And especially if, I mean, pregnancy in a dog is not always the best thing. I mean, it is, there are risks to doing it. So you don't want the puppies in the first place. In second place, you do put your dog at risk. Plus, there's a higher rate of cancer in dogs that do not go through spaying and neutering. So that's another upside to doing that. But anyway, that's an example of pheromones. So ants use it to mark. So if you say you have ants in your kitchen and you brush them away, they're going to show up again. Have you ever noticed how they'll always stick to a particular trail, to a particular path? That's because they're laying down pheromones so that they can actually follow their brethren to the stash of muffins or whatever it happens to be, right? So if you do that, you can't just brush them off. You have to use soap and water and get rid of the pheromone track. Otherwise, they're just going to come right back and find your muffins and go for it again. Okay. I think we have pheromones. There's been some studying about it, but there hasn't been a lot of research that show that we respond much to pheromones as human beings. So it's something that we've kind of evolved out of, the smelling. Okay, let's see. Where am I going here? Okay, now we're going to talk about endocrine system specifically. And when we do that, we got to talk about the different kinds of hormones that there are. And they fall into basically two major categories that we're going to talk about, which is whether or not they can get across the cell membrane on their own. So if they are water soluble, they are hydrophilic. We know that from our first unit. And if they are lipid soluble, they don't like water, they're going to be hydrophobic. These two categories are important because how they get across the cell membrane is different in a very, very different way. Protein hormones are we could probably get rid of that are water soluble. So if, for example, trying to think of, insulin. Insulin would be a example of a protein hormone. And we're actually going to talk about insulin. Or you all are going to talk about insulin in your project, I should say. Steroid hormones and other large nonpolar hormones are lipid soluble. So let me put here for the protein, it was insulin. And steroid, anybody know what a steroid is? Hormone? Estrogen. Yeah, good. Estrogen and testosterone. The thyroid hormones are also lipid soluble. They're not steroid hormones, but they are lipid soluble. We're also going to be looking in your project at estrogen or testosterone. So lots of fun stuff. Did I mention your project is going to be on you making a comic or a story? Or a story. I'll let you do story if you're not a drawer. Ooh, podcast. That could be interesting. 4-person podcast. Oh, a podcast. I'm not sure about 4-person. It's an individual project. What do you think about it? We just talk about biology. Okay. We're not going to get to the project today. Just alluding to it today. Water soluble molecules. Can they get through the bloodstream on their own? Kind of set that up for the wrong answer, I think. Water soluble hormones they get through the bloodstream freely. Yeah, you can actually read it on here. Yeah. So if you're water soluble, your blood is also mostly water. So they're able to travel on their own. Nope, that's not what I wanted. They can travel freely through the bloodstream. But the problem is they cannot get across the cell membrane on their own if they're water soluble. They need help to get across. That's the bane of many biology students, is trying to get across that cell membrane. If you're lipid soluble, can you get across? Can you go through the bloodstream on your own? No, you actually need a carrier. So you'll get a carrier, a transport protein, if you're lipid soluble, to get across through the bloodstream. However, once you get to the cell membrane is lipo-friendly. So you can get through the cell membrane without any helpers, without any cell receptors. So they can diffuse through the membrane to the target cells on their own. And that's the huge difference between those protein hydrophilic molecules and the lipid hydrophobic molecules. All right, let's see what we got here. Make sure I'm on the right. There we go. Okay. So we have two pictures here showing the different ways to get across. In the one, it's water soluble, meaning that it can travel through the bloodstream on its own. It doesn't need any help. So here, if you look at that picture closely, it's showing that it doesn't need a transport protein, but it does need something to help it at the surface of the cell membrane. It cannot get across on its own. So in order to get that message to the inside of the cell, it's going to need some helper bees to do that. If, on the other hand, you are lipid soluble, you're going to need help to get there. And so the picture shows that there's a little helper molecule that is hydrophilic that says, I'll take you, and then it will taxi you through the bloodstream. But then once you get to the target cell, you can go directly to the nucleus on your own, and you do not need any help from anyone to get there. Okay, good job. Good job, lipophilic. Good job. I think I'm actually going to stop there because I want to check something out.